Hello, and welcome to this edition of Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm D.P. Lyle. Today I want to talk about those pesky rules of writing. You know, the ones everybody spouts and says this is the way you do it and this is the way you don't do it and yada yada. Um, Somerset Maugham is famously attributed to having started this little tidbit. There are three rules of novel writing. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are. It's controversial as to whether he actually said that or he was the originator of it, but regardless, it's a great rule. There are no rules. You can write any way you want. And I think that is the key to successful fiction. It's the key to you developing your voice and telling your story your way. Um, Sure, I mean, there are rules of grammar. You have to understand punctuation and things like that. Even those are fluid. Strunk and White and all the other rules and regulations that have been put out there have come under fire in the last decade or so because rules are made to be broken. Remember, this is storytelling, and it's storytelling at its finest when you talk about crime fiction, I believe. But at the end of the day, it's storytelling, such as a duck walks into a bar and he hops up on the bar and he says, "Hey, barkeep, let me have a beer." Bartender turns around and looks at him and says, "Hey, we don't serve beer to ducks in here. Get the hell out." So the duck leaves. The next day he comes back and he hops up on the bar and says, "Hey, barkeep, how about that beer?" He said, "I told you yesterday, Jack, we don't serve beer to ducks here. Now, if you come back again, I'm going to nail your bill to the bar." So the duck leaves. He comes back a third day and hops up on the bar and says, "Hey, barkeep." And he turns around and looks at him with an exasperated look. The duck says, "You got any nails?" And the guy said, "No, I don't have any nails." He said, "Good, I'll have a beer." Now that's a story. Think about every joke you've ever heard. It's got three parts to it. There's the setup. There's the raising of the stakes, in this case, the nails, the threat to the duck. And then there is the clever twist at the end where the hero saves the day. This is the three-act structure. And so you say, well, there must be a three-act structure to my story. No, there mustn't be. Now, in all honesty, it will probably work out that way because that's kind of the way we tell stories to one another. But don't sit there and design your story as if to say, well, this is the first turning point and this is the second turning point and this is, the climax, and all those things will happen automatically if you get out of your way and tell your story. I think you will, when you read books, you will find that they're a lot messier than just the three-act structure. It's a good guide. Don't get me wrong, it's a good guide. And like I said, you will naturally end up telling a story in three parts because that's kind of the way we do things. But don't think about that. Just think about telling the story. And as Somerset Maugham may have said, remember there are no rules. But there are rules. And people make up rules all the time, and some of them are very clever and very useful. I think by far the most important, Dave Barry says, don't be boring. And if you find that you're writing and you're in a scene and you're not happy with it and you're bored with it, the reader is not going to be happy and they're going to be bored with it. We've all been there, we've all done it, and you just say, this scene is flat, it's not working, I don't like this. Steinbeck, and I have a link to this in one of his rules, so to speak, or his advice to writers, said if you're having trouble with a scene and it's just not working right, move on. Go to the next scene and continue writing. I think this is critically important. If you have something that's not working, don't let it stop you. Don't let it end your story and get you into a writer's block situation like, oh my God, I got to get over this hump. No, you don't. You just go past it. And then you write. And he famously and I think intelligently said that once you do that and then you go back, what you probably find most often is that scene wasn't needed. It wasn't necessary for this story. And that's why it stopped you. I think this happens all too often. Now, Terry Brooks, a great writer, known as the chief elf, as it were. Terry writes the Shannara series, and I think he was actually had the first fantasy science sci-fi book to reach the New York Times bestseller list with Sword of Shannara. I believe that's true. Regardless, way back in the dark ages, when the Maui Writers Conference was still in existence, and they developed this program called the Maui Writers Retreat, which was a 4-day intensive on working really hard on your writing. There were about 10 or 12 people per class, and you had a teacher. It's kind of where the current Craft Fest at Thriller Fest spun off from. My experience there at Maui Writers Conference kind of led me to believe that a class such as that would be good for international thriller writers and their writers conference. But Terry Brooks, I took the first Maui Writers Retreat, 4 days. Like I said, you didn't see the sunshine. And Terry Brooks was my mentor, and he's a great guy and a great teacher and a great writer. His rules are simple: read, 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 outline, 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 write, 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 repeat. And I think there's so much to there. The repeat is important. Do it over and over and over again, and you'll get better at it. You're never good first time out of the blocks. Everybody says your first novel is your learning novel. But as you write more and more and more, and you repeat the process, you get better at it. But read, read, read is important. You must read. You must learn how other people do it. You must learn how stories are structured. Now, there are many great books out there on writing, on how to tell stories, on how to craft, how to write fiction, how to pump up the suspense and the tension and all those books. I've read over 100 of them. They're wonderful, and they all offer some little gems. But at the end of the day, you learn by an apprenticeship. In medical school, you do that. You hang out with people who know more than you. And those are usually the residents and interns and people above you when you're a student, the staff physicians. And you learn by working with them and seeing how they think, what they do, and how they do it. So it's an apprenticeship. Writing's the same way, but your apprenticeship is reading. And you read and you read and you read and you read across all genres. Most of your reading's obviously going to be in the genre that you prefer, what you like, but step outside of it every now and then. What are you going to learn by doing this? All the things I talked about, plus you're going to learn that there's no one way to tell a story. There's no one rhythm to a story. There's no one structure of a story, that everybody does it differently. And what you will see out there, because there are so many, especially now in the last 20 years, there's so many different ways to tell a story and so many wonderfully ways that stories are written that it's going to give you permission to move down the path you want to move down to tell your story. That's the confidence of finding your voice. You're going to see that, oh, these rules, I can't do this, I can't, because it says, no, you can do anything you want. You can write the story any way you want. Now, outline, outline, outline. Terry was a big outliner. Now, he writes these big epics. So, world building and character building and all that stuff are a huge part of fantasy fiction, because you have to create a world that's not this world. And so you really have to educate people a lot. You have to create creatures that are not of this world. So you have to educate people a lot. And so there's a lot of balls to keep in the air in this world building world of fantasy fiction. And so outlining is not a bad thing at all there. In fact, outlining is not a bad thing at all at any time. I know when I started, I wrote outlines. I would write like a paragraph of what each scene was going to be about. But I found that after about 30 scenes, I got bored with it because, well, okay, now I know where the story's going and I'm tired of doing this. So I would then go back and start writing and then continue the outline as I moved along. I think if you're doing police procedurals or things that are very convoluted in their plotting, then maybe outlining is necessary. But in other fiction and many writers, they say they don't outline. My last few books, I haven't really outlined, but I'm going to tell you, people who say they don't outline actually do. They just do it in their head. You're always thinking 2 or 3 scenes ahead. You're not just in the moment. That almost never happens. Many of my books have started with one or two scenes, and I thought these are fun and they will take me somewhere. Let's see where it goes. Particularly my Jake Longley series, which is kind of a comedic thrillers. I just start with a scene. The first book, Deep Six, I had a single scene. And it was Jake sitting out in front of his ex-wife's house in a car. He was actually doing surveillance on another house, and all hell breaks loose because Tammy, his ex, is insane and sees him out there and thinks he's spying on her. And things go, well, as they say, south from there. But that's the only scene I had in mind when I started the story. I didn't know who the bad guys were. I didn't know where the story was going. I didn't know how it was going to end, but all of that evolved. So sometimes outlining is necessary, and sometimes outlining gets in the way. That's all a personal choice. Now, it changes as to the type of story you're writing. As I said, some need more structure and more outline because you got to make sure that it all makes sense in the end, especially things like police procedurals and whatnot. But if you're just writing your fiction, sometimes try it. Just get out of the way and tell the story. The third grouping in Terry's rules are write. And there's no question, if you're going to be a writer, you have to write. And you have to write over and over and over again. And some of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be awful, and that's fine. I always tell people, write the first draft fast. Don't worry about the nuances. Don't worry about all the internal dialogue. Don't worry about the setting and the descriptions and all that. Now, if they come up while you're writing the scene, fine. Stick them in there. But don't belabor it. Because as you write a story, especially if it's a new story, it's not part of a series, you've got new characters, you've got new people, you've got a new setting, you've got things that you don't understand yet. You don't know these people that you have chosen to populate your story with, the ones you're going to live with for the next 6 to 12 months. So why belabor the point of what they're thinking and how they talk and all of that? Because you don't know them yet. It's going to take time. So write the story. Get the 70,000 words of the first draft out and then go back and start fleshing it out. Now you'll go back to the first 5 chapters and say, well, she wouldn't have said that. He wouldn't have thought that. And he damn sure wouldn't have done that. And she doesn't think that way or talk that way or dress that way or anything because, well, actually, that's not even her name. You've changed. I've done that before. Change the name of a character halfway through the story, and then you come back to the beginning and say, who the heck is Martha? And you realize Martha became Deborah halfway through the story because that fit her better. So the point is that write and write fast and get your story out and then go back and rewrite to fix it. But write. So read to educate, outline if you so choose to organize, and then write to get it done. Now, probably the most famous rules of writing, and people have argued about them for years, are Elmore Leonard's 10 rules of writing. Now, all this stuff is going to be in the show notes on my website and the blog, so you don't have to write these down. But Elmore's first rule is never open a book with a weather. Okay, listen to this. Her hair is curly and gold on the pillow, her skin white in the heat lightning that trembles beyond the pecan trees outside the bedroom window. The night is hot and breathless, the clouds painted like horsetails against the sky. A peal of thunder rumbles on the gulf like an apple rolling around in the bottom of a wooden barrel, and the first raindrops ping against the window fan. She sleeps on her side, the sheet molds her thighs, the curve of her hip, her breast. In the flicker of the heat lightning, the sun freckles on her bare shoulder look like brown flaws in sculpted marble. Wow. That is the first paragraph of Black Cherry Blues by James Lee Burke. It's one of the 2 books he won the Edgar for. Gee, I wonder why. You see the weather in there? Not only does Mr. Burke start this story with the weather, he starts many stories with the weather. He also starts many chapters in his stories with the weather. So right away, you see a flaw in Elmore's reasoning. that the weather, particularly in the Dave Robichaux series that take place down in the Atchafalaya Basin down in Louisiana and the swamp country, weather is a character, and it infuses and affects everything that people do, how they dress, how they talk, what they eat, how they walk. That weather, that location is a character. It is the milieu that these people live in, and you could not tell his stories without invoking the weather. So does that mean Elmore's wrong? No. I think what Elmore's saying is don't start stories with extraneous stuff. Don't try to give too many descriptions and give too much of the setting until you get the ball rolling. You don't really care how many lanes are in the bowling alley until the ball hits the pins. Then you can look around and say, oh, this is a big place or this is a small place. But get the ball rolling first. Now, in James Lee Burke's hands, the ball is rolling because the writing is just so incredible. Well, you and I are not James Lee Burke, but that doesn't mean you can't start with the weather, but be careful. Often it's just clearing your throat. It's kind of getting ready to start the story. Just get the story started. Number 2 is avoid prologues. Well, this is a huge controversy, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Some agents and editors love prologues, others hate them. I think the reason they hate them is a lot of them aren't handled well. They're kind of thrown in because there was some cool research done, and let's throw in some of this stuff so people see how smart I am. But if a prologue is something that is removed in time and place from the main story, though that's not always necessary, but usually is, removed in time and place, and it is necessary to give context to the remainder of the story, or it will echo back toward the end, toward the climax, or somewhere in the story, or somewhere in the character development, then sure, go with it. At the end of the day, probably the only rule of writing that really makes any sense is if it works, it works. So look at prologues carefully. Should it just simply be chapter 1, or should it simply be eliminated? That's your decision. It's your story. Number 3, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. Well, I think that's good. You say said or asked or replied, simple things. But once you start stepping into bellowing and retorting and things like that, it starts becoming purple. It becomes purple prose, and it becomes overwritten, and it looks like it's writing. Which is another one of Elmore's rules, is that if it sounds like writing, rewrite it. That's not in his top 10, but it is in there. So try to use said and ask and replied and keep it simple. Don't use all those flowery words. Number 4 follows right on. It says never use an adverb to modify the verb said. She said brightly. She said hotly. Let the body language, the verbiage, the story, the context, let all that carry the hotly or sadly or whatever. Don't tell the reader what the emotion is that they're supposed to feel. Let them feel it. Number 5, keep your exclamation points under control. No more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words. Well, I think a good rule is if you can write an entire novel without a single exclamation point, you're way ahead of the game. Again, let the context, let the language, let the delivery, let the body language, let everything about the scene tell you that there's an exclamation at the end of the sentence. Don't try not to use exclamation points. I think that's good advice. Never use the word suddenly or all hell broke loose. Now that's so Elmore. But again, it's that shock value, that twist, that using a word that is telling you what you're supposed to feel. Let the story, let the context, let the writing convey the emotion. So if something happens suddenly, then let it happen suddenly. You don't have to tell us it's going to be sudden. We're going to see it. Number 7, use regional dialect, patois, sparingly. And this is so true. I write a lot of my stuff in the South, and I really try to avoid the the apostrophe and dropped G. You might drop one in every now and then, but I've written entire books in Southern language without doing it a single time. And that's the simplest of dialects. I do use the word ain't a lot because, well, for us Southerners, that's a pretty good word. Um, but give a little bit, just enough to give the flavor, and then let the rhythm and the syntax and the word choice carry over that feeling of the region, of the dialect. But don't get deeply in the dialects, because what happens is the reader has to slow down to decipher it. They have to think, oh, what are they saying here that I'm not familiar with? And once you do that, then you've taken the reader out of the story, and you as the writer have stepped in between and say, see how clever I am. Number 8, avoid detailed descriptions of characters. Well, I like this. Number 9 is don't go into great detail describing places and things. I think these two go together. Give the telling details. Give one or two little things about the character. There are many times that characters are never described, ever, in a story. And yet the action, the dialogue, what goes on, what the characters do, what they say, how they think, creates a mental image in the reader that they create the character within their head. Remember, reading is a collaborative process. It's not like watching a movie. If you watch a movie, 100 people watch a movie, they all see the same movie. But if 100 people read a book, they all read a different book because they see things differently. One of the things I always tell students, talking about the telling detail, is to walk into half a dozen places you've never been in your life. It could be a tire store or a bar or a grocery store or a flower shop, anything. Walk in, excuse me, to a place you've never been and stop and scribble down the first 3 or 4 things that hit you. Is it something you see, you hear, you smell? Is it an attitude of the people there? Is it a feeling? Write it down, and then write down the next 5 or 6 things that you see. So when you go back and use that as a location for a scene, remember those first few things that strike you. They are the things that give the flavor of the location. You do not have to go into great descriptive detail unless it is important that something's in a certain location or described a certain way. Let the reader build it in their own mind. Lastly, and his most famous tip, is try to leave out the parts that readers tend to skip. Now, this is brilliant, and if you have not read Elmore Leonard, you absolutely must read Elmore Leonard, particularly if you write crime fiction. He's known as the king of dialogue, and he is all that and more. His dialogue is spot on. It has subtext. It is funny. It is witty. It is clean. It is concise. It conveys the entire story very quickly. But his entire writing is that way. The way he gets into and out of scenes, the way he sets up locations, the way he creates characters and have them interact, the way things unfold in his stories are so clean and so efficient that all of us can learn so much from him. Excuse me. So, at the end of the day, the rules of writing are there are none. Of course, you have to learn to punctuate. You have to learn to build sentences. But you don't have to make complete sentences in fiction. You have to learn to tell a story, and I think that is the key. Remember the little duck. The duck, if that duck left after the 3rd try and drank himself to death, that'd be a literary novel. If that duck went out and decided, I'm going to get even with that bartender, and came back in and shot him, that would be a crime novel. If that duck went out and pulled off his feathers and came back in on a tux, it would be James Bond. The point is that same story can be told in a lot of different genres, but at the end of the day, it's a story. Learn to tell your story your way, and do not let the rules handcuff you. So I hope this has been useful to some of you out there. And that concludes this episode of Criminal Mischief. And until next time, this is DP Lyle signing off.